think I'm going to sit down for this if you don't mind.
Sure.
Just a little bit easier. This journal, the transcript of the journal of William Burnie, has a long story to it. It was found in the attic of a house in Glasgow, Scotland. And it turns out that the man who owned the house went to medical school with Dr. Burnie in Edinburgh. And how he ended up with Dr. Burnie's journal is unknown, but at any rate, it was found there. And ended up in the hands of a lady in Dublin, whose name is Gay Ashford. And she took on the job of trying to read Dr. Burnie's handwriting. And you know what reading a doctor's handwriting is like. And she transcribed it for us. We were very, very pleased to get this journal at the museum. And as we studied it, at the Peterborough Museum and Archives, that is, where I was working at the time. As we studied it, we found that some of the assumptions that we had made about the immigrants and how they were treated and what their journey was like were completely different than what we originally thought. So this is a different way of looking at the story of the 1825 immigration of those 2,024 people from the south of Ireland who came here to settle in Smith and Emily and Durrow and Asphodel and all the townships around here. Don's going to be Dr. Burnie, and he's going to be reading excerpts from the journal. I have to tell you that as long as this is tonight, we left a lot out. So let's get started and not waste any more time.
Otherwise, we'd still be here tomorrow.
Right, so we would be here tomorrow. William Burnie was born on June the 7th, 1792, in Barskew, Galloway, Scotland, the oldest of 8 children. He grew up on his parents' farm and he attended local schools. He received his medical qualifications at the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh at the age of 20. And he joined the Royal Navy as assistant surgeon on HMS Elizabeth. He was stationed in the Leeward Islands. And it was a tense time for a new recruit because war had just broken out between America and Britain. 10 years later, we find Burnie appointed surgeon aboard the Royal Navy's HMS Tartar. And for the next 9 years, he sailed the world, the Caribbean to India, to North and South America. But his health began to decline, and he writes in his journal.
June 17th, 1824. Was myself very ill this morning with uneasy pain at epigastrium, headache, heat, and sense of weight in the right side, which has continued at times for 12 months. Pulse sometimes intermitting, weakness of limbs, pain at right shoulder. Ankles appear stiff and rather swelled in the evening. Applied a blister to right side.
Remember, Burnie was still in his 30s at this time. So he applied a blister, and this was a plaster made from the dried and powdered blister beetle, which is found in the southern states and in Central and South America. It was applied to the skin, raising an intensely painful blister. The blister would ooze, of course, and that made it appear that it was removing illness from the body. The blisters in this photograph were caused by coming into limited contact with a live beetle. So you can imagine the strength of a plaster made from them. So Burnie returned to England in July 1824 on half pay. He took up lodgings at 1 York Street, Covent Garden, which is still there today, and it was not far from the Admiralty. The next year, Burnie was offered an appointment by the Navy Board as surgeon on board the John Barry. The John Barry was originally a convict ship that carried convicts to Australia, and it had been changed over to be an emigrant ship. Apparently, when they carried the immigrants, there were 253 on board. When they went to Australia, there were about 550, so very different conditions. It's most likely that it was moored at the Deptford docks in London, and Burnie sailed from there to Cork on the ship. Burnie was responsible for the health of the immigrants, their food, their lodging, and their safety, and his journal begins as he supervises the loading of supplies.
Thursday, 12th of May, 1825. Morning fine with showers at times. Came alongside 2 potato boats and were on the 2 deliveries, 11 tons.
Just before I go on, I have to apologize for the text being off here. This computer is different to mine at home, and it changed the font and everything, but I didn't have time to fix it. Well, along with potatoes, the immigrants received rations of beef, pork, flour, ship's biscuits, tea, cocoa, and oatmeal. Dr. Burnie had wine, ordered for women in labor, and porter beer that he gave to sickly babies. Grog, the mixture of water, sugar, lime, and rum, was served to sailors twice a day, and the male Robinson immigrants may also have received a ration of grog, although the journal's a bit confusing on this point. Just recently, there were articles printed in the Examiner about the immigrants coming, and the statement was made that they had to exist on salt pork and ship's biscuit. And you see, that was the old assumption. You see, it's not true. They had much more variety. Oh, and here's the happy medical page. The medical wisdom of the day required that sickness be expunged from the body in as many ways as the patient could bear. Dr. Burnie has bleeding and blistering at his disposal, both of which he uses freely. Most of the medicines he used are available as patent medicines today. Whatever the complaint, a patient consulting Dr. Burnie can be sure of receiving laxatives of increasing strength until the desired effect is obtained, and that to be followed by cac, which makes you throw up. If there is no improvement, he moves on to blistering and bleeding, preferably until the patient faints. Tincture of opium is given for coughs, to restore bowel function, or to calm a restless child.
Friday, 13th of May. At 6 a.m., washed and scraped the lower deck, got up the windsails. At 2 p.m., came on board from the Elizabeth Emigrant Transport 47 settlers, men 16, women 10, and children 21. Showed their berths, and in the evening gave them a proportion of beds and blankets.
The windsails that Burnie mentions were small sails that were mounted like scoops above the hatches to catch fresh air and direct it to the decks below. 2 cooks are appointed to Quebec.
People to give a penny a head, the captain a canvas frock coat and trousers each, and myself $1 each at Quebec. At 6 p.m. came on board from the City of Cork steamer vessel another 6 settlers, 2 men, 1 woman, and 3 children. Served them beds, etc.
A week passes, and Dr. Burnie has established a schedule that he will follow as closely as possible throughout the voyage. And I'm sorry again, it looked better than that on the other computer, but anyway, Dr. Burnie will read it to you.
6:30 a.m., beds taken up to top deck. 8 o'clock a.m., breakfast. 9:30 a.m., berth deck scrubbed, scraped, sprinkled with hot vinegar and or fumigated with sulfur. 1 o'clock p.m., dining on deck. 6 o'clock p.m., supper. 6:30 p.m., beds taken down to the berth deck.
Over the next few days, more immigrants arrive, and others are sent to the Elizabeth, on orders of Mr. Robinson to make up the numbers.
Sunday, 22nd of May. At 5, thick rain with light winds. Sprinkled, scraped, and swept the decks. Bedding kept below. At 1 p.m. got underway and came down the harbor. At 2:30, Mr. Robinson and a Mr. Callahan visited and inspected the emigrants by families for the last time. Tuesday, 25th of May, at 10, got underway and beat out of the harbor. At 1:30, discharged the pilot. Fresh breezes and fine, several getting seasick. And see how well we rehearsed this. Friday, 27th of May, women generally sick. Some women tipsy, a cure for seasickness. Had the decks swept and the underberths cleaned out. PM, smooth water, all the people improving. Kept them mostly on deck, music and dancing. Saturday, May 28th. Served 2.5 bottles of lime juice in proportionate shares. Washed clothes, all the women, and hung them in proper lines. Most people on deck, and all getting better of seasickness, all people to dance. Sunday, May 29th. The settlers went to prayers, all Roman Catholic except 4 or 5 families. I offered Bibles and Testaments obtained from a minister at Cove to those who wished them. Monday, May 30th. Timothy Callahan was detected taking another man's flour cake and punished, after being found guilty by 12 of his peers, by cleaning the nursery for 2 days. Smart breeze with some sea getting up. People beginning to get seasick.
By June the 2nd, strong gales and heavy rain had driven the John Barry off course. The wind sails are taken down, the hatches are lowered, and as the gales continue, the beds are taken up and lashed to the back of the berths. Most are seasick and complain of headache, for which Burnie gives nitrous ether, lime juice, and castor oil. All the sick are given oatmeal to make gruel. Chronically seasick are Mrs. Barragy and Mrs. Groves. I sympathize, those poor women. Timothy Regan, who had come aboard ill at Cork, is raging with fever. 2 days later, the John Barry has packed her way back on course.
Saturday, 4th of June. At 10, every person but very sick on deck. Washed ship. First scraped the deck, then sprinkled and scrubbed. Swept well the berths and sprinkled them all with vinegar. Dined on deck at 1:30.
The weather turns foul again. Strong gales, squalls, and rains. A heavy spray comes over the quarterdeck, wetting and frightening the immigrants. The ship must be pumped 4 times a day, but the larboard pump and the main deck are leaking onto the berth deck. Dr. Burnie calls the carpenter, but it is a challenge to keep things clean.
At 1 p.m., dinner. People wrangling with cook. They say he boils their provisions too much for sake of slush. He denies it and says that they put it in so irregularly that some of it will be overdone. He threatens giving up the cooking. Settled the dispute by allowing everyone to take out his meat when he likes. If I may. He mentions slush. Slush is a Royal Navy tradition, a maritime tradition. When everything gets boiled, there's no roasting or anything. So meat gets boiled, and the slush is the fat that rises to the top. And it was the cook's allowance to scrape it off and to sell it to passengers, or in the case of a Royal Navy ship, the crew. And that was used, it was spread on top of the hard biscuit to soften it down. But that was how they made a little extra cash, was by selling the slush. So if you had really fatty meat, which they often did, the more you boiled it, the more slush you get, the more pennies you get. Sunday, June 12th, midnight. Heavy gales and thick with rain. People between decks, some praying, some crying out murder, some swearing. A few believed the sailors getting out the boats to leave them. Carried away the foremast larboard, shroud fore-rigging, split the foretop sail and the topmast staysail. Tremendous sea. This is from a guy who's been around Cape Horn.
As the John Berry approaches Newfoundland, thick fog and heavy rains cause the windsails to be taken down and the hatches closed again. The battle to keep the decks dry and clean continues. Mrs. Callahan gives birth to a baby girl they named Mary.
Sunday, June 19th, at 7, made the island of Newfoundland, tacked ship to southward. I spoke to the brig Henderson from Conception to Quebec.
Timothy Regan's wife has refused to leave his side in the sick bay, but she will soon be giving birth. Dr. Burnie supplies her with calico and flannels for 2 changes of dress for the baby. On the 22nd, she gives birth to a tiny child, a daughter, in her 8th month. This child will die at Kingston. Appropriately for the Grand Banks, several codfish are caught and divided among the sickly families.
Thursday, June 23rd. Moderate winds and clear weather. Scraped and swept the decks and cleaned out every berth. Fumigated the decks and each berth with hot vinegar, also the sick bay. People dined on deck. Deck below dry and clean and every berth well aired, having lifted the underboards. Friday, June 24th. Spoke to the Margaret of Liverpool, 6 days from Quebec. 3 of our ships have arrived, the Brunswick 1. Saturday, June 25th. Steady breezes and clear. People washing and drying clothes. Dine on deck. Sunday, 26th of June. Thick fog, dinner below. Heavy showers, downed windsails on hatches. Monday, 27th of June. Tacked ship 4 miles to windward off 7 islands. Weather fine, people dined on deck. Midnight,
Dr. Burnie had begun treating baby Dennis Shea on June the 20th. He writes that the child is delicate and weakly and coughs with difficult respiration. He prescribes a warm bath, calomel, and ricin, or castor oil, then later antimony wine and squills, which is a combination with opium. As the baby's debility increases, he applies a blister. The next morning, he finds the mother has taken it off. She refuses to give her child any more medicine, is very sorry the blister was applied, and will not allow another. He is clearly frustrated. Eventually, the mother does consent to give the baby a diluted mixture of opium. She keeps him constantly in her arms.
midnight departed this life Dennis Shea, aged 1 year and 9 months.
Wednesday, June the 29th. Burnie is awakened at 4 a.m. with news that the ship is aground at Point Batsiamit.
Ship lies broadside on a sandy beach, head to westward. People in terror, but after much trouble, persuaded them there was no danger. One kedge was got out, but failed to heave the ship off, waited for next tide.
In order to kedge a ship, you got the anchor that had the most flukes, is that the right? Right. It had the most flukes on, and would row it out into the deep water. Now, of course, it was still attached to the ship by a cable or rope. The idea then was to lodge that kedge anchor securely in the bottom. And then back on the ship, the rope would be wrapped around the capstan And the people would, the sailors mostly, in this case it's immigrants as well, wind the rope around the capstan. Now the idea is that instead of dragging in the anchor, the secure anchor drags the ship out. Okay, that's how it's supposed to work. However, by afternoon there is a strong gale with heavy seas breaking against and flying over the ship, and the people below are in terror. A second attempt is made to catch the ship.
Hove her head around, but, owing to high winds, she turned on her keel and went broadside on, head to eastward. Her head afloat, but fast by the stern. Waited for the next tide.
As they wait, Burnie reports that many of the immigrants have volunteered to assist and stay up all night to heave the ship off. But others are grumbling and frightening the women with tales of disaster.
Thursday, 30th of June. At 1 a.m. began to heave the ship off. Emigrants assisting at the capstan and hauling ropes. Discovered 6 feet water in the hold. Set both pumps to work, emigrants pumping. At 5, hove the ship off and kedged her to 14 fathoms of water. Both pumps at work with ship's crew and emigrants. Gained on the water in the hold 3 feet in 24 hours. PM. The infant child of Martin O'Brien died and was buried on shore. Part of the immigrants desirous of being landed, as they say, from the clamor of their wives. Several refractory, threatening to cut the cable and destroy the pumps. Forming plots below and openly tell me that they think it our intention to get into the boats and leave them, although I have told them many a time I will muster them myself, by families, into the boats, and with the captain, be the last person to leave the ship. At 5, clamorous to be on shore, could not land for surf, promised tomorrow. Friday, 1st July, a.m. Crew and part of the emigrants working both pumps. 4 of the women wrought all night at pumps. At 4 a.m., 2 feet of water in the hold. 5 a.m., ordered breakfast with the intention of landing the people. Much of the luggage on the berth deck, emigrants having got it up in spite of orders to the contrary. The master, for preservation of ship and stores, promised 30 men, $1 per day, to work at the pumps to Quebec. 6 a.m., people preparing to go on shore, so harassed by their cries and threats that I asked the sentiments of each head of family whether he wished to go on shore or trust in the officers. 12 would be put on shore unconditionally. The remainder trust to the officers and obey. 8 a.m. The 12 families insisted on being put on shore, which Master and I myself quieted by resolving to move the ship to the government post 6 miles further up to land the people. 9 a.m. Mr. Kelly, pilot, came on board. 18 inches water in hold.
One of the families on the John Barry were the Youngs from Youngs Point, and where it says 4 of the women wrought all night at the pumps, the suspicion is that some of them were the young women. They were no wallflowers, those girls. As the pilot guides the ship upriver, the men who were clamoring to be put on shore are now begging to have a turn at the pumps. Nothing to do with the dollar, probably, but anyway. They run aground again at Quail Point, which is the town of Montmagny in Quebec. But the tide lifts the ship free, and they stop for the night off Madame Island, not far from Quebec.
Thursday, July 7th. At 6, weighed and plied up to the town. Came to with small bower and chain. Tipped the anchor and washed alongside the dockyard and moored ship.
Dr. Burnie goes ashore to arrange transportation to Montreal. When he returns to the John Barry, he allows several heads of families to go ashore to procure necessities. Timothy Regan is still seriously ill. Most likely he had cholera. And I think it's to Burnie's credit that it doesn't spread, thanks to all that hot vinegar on the ship. In the isolation, yeah, he was kept in isolation. At any rate, Burnie judges him unfit to continue, so he, his wife, and 5 children are sent to the emigrant hospital in Quebec. Burnie has the people's luggage sent on deck and 3 days provisions issued in preparation for the move on to Montreal.
Friday, July 8th. At 6 a.m. came alongside the steamboat New Swiftsure, handed over the people's luggage, and sent themselves on board without any incident. Weather very hot and close. At 8 made sail. Several of the children very unwell. Afternoon passing up the river, which appears thickly populated. Had the utmost difficulty in procuring a berth for the sick in steerage, which contains only 33 bed places and was then occupied by 150 people. Most of the people slept on deck. Big surprise. Weather fine and warm. Made awnings of rugs and blankets. At 10, passed the town of 3 Rivers. At 12, in St. Peter's Lake. Saturday, July 9th. Morning fine and clear and very hot. People suffering from their exposed and crowded state. Caused the feverish to be well bathed in tepid water. We stopped at the town of McHenry, or Sorel, to take in wood. Some of the people went on shore for milk, etc. At 9, reached Montreal. Went on shore to Commissary Ashworth. He thinks we must wait until Monday, but promised to try for Sunday. Very anxious from the state of the ship to go Sunday. Sunday, July 10th. At 8 came aboard Mr. Connell, stating the carts could be procured. Signed a requisition for 70. At 9 began to load them, placing the beds and light articles below and the women and children over them. At 10, sent off the last family, the men remaining to remove their heavy luggage. At 12, cleaned the ship of everything and sent them on to Lachine. At 2, arrived at Lachine. Got all the people together into a large store with all their luggage. It has 6 double doors and is very airy. Found Surgeon Powers and the Elizabeth party. Many of their children ill with whooping cough. Forbid all intercourse. Allotted proper berths, nearly as in the ship, and divided them from each other by their luggage.
At Lachine, they wait for the military to provide boats. The canal bypassing the rapids has just recently been completed. The weather is very hot and humid, and Burnie reports that the children are suffering from the heat. Dennis Mahoney, 15, has a blister applied. He takes 45 ounces of blood from John Kelleher, has his head and shoulders bathed in cold water, and gives him a dose of Epsom salts. The hot weather isn't helping tempers.
Tuesday, July 12th. At 9, supplied beef for yesterday and today in proportions. Casey complained because he had part of a hip joint that he would take no more if Barragy cut it. Told him Barragy should continue to do so as long as I was with them, and that he knew not to whom he gave it, no names being mentioned till all was cut and weighed. Young Leary, on someone asking if they might be allowed to labor, said they would require to work if they got nothing but bones. I told him not to be so saucy. He said he would leave me when he liked. I told him he had better not unless he wished to visit Montreal jail.
Several of the men are given leave to hire with the different farms in the neighborhood where hay is being harvested. There's another sick child, 1-year-old John Slattery, who is lethargic and breathing heavily. Burnie gives him tincture of ether to relieve his fever and has the child bathed in warm water. He bleeds a young child of the Dunhill family and gives him castor oil. Friday,
July 15. About midnight died Slattery's child. procured wood for a coffin for the child, and gave a sick sheet to wrap it in. PM. Went to Upper Lachine in a market cart to see McGough, well acquainted with my father. Very talkative and recollects all about Galloway. Got bread and cheese and bumpers of brandy. Saturday, July 16th. Commissary Finlay granted 10 boats and would give no more. PM. Arrived Mrs. Regan and family, her husband having died at Quebec the day after landing. His widow has suffered much from the fatigue of the passage. Sunday, July 17th. Thermometer 120 in the sun, 88 in the shade. Dunhill baby very ill. Parents see he cannot live until morning and will not allow me to put a blister to abdomen, and with difficulty to give him medicine, saying it is useless and only tormenting the child.
The boats provided at Lachine are military bateaux. They can be rowed, hauled through rapids, or sailed in calmer waters.
Tuesday, July 19th. Mrs. Regan dying, sent for a priest. Got the people into the boats at 11 a.m. Mrs. Owens and son would not go into the boat and went away towards Montreal, saying she would go home with her sons. An extra trunk of Mr. Robinson's being put into Leary's boat, said he would be damned if he went into it. I collared him and put him in. Swore he would not pull. I told him to sit idle in the boat. At 11, sent away the boats and detained my own boat for Mrs. Regan and some women attending to her. At 12, she died. Left the charge of the funeral to Commissary Finlay and proceeded after the boats. At 5:30, a violent thunderstorm obliged to put ashore in Ile Parrot. At 9, reached the Cascades, dreadfully wet and uncomfortable. Got the people into a hayloft and empty stores for the night. Slept at Waters Inn. PM. Reached the Cedars at 1 p.m., where the people dined. At 4:30, proceeded on the passage. Dunhill's boy very ill, others mending. Wednesday, July 20th. Passed the locks at 8. Died Daniel Maloney, 4 months old. Pushed on, the rapids being very difficult and severe on the people, who are obliged to track the boats through them, sometimes to the middle of the water. Women and children obliged to walk. Indians very troublesome, wanting money to drink. Others tossing luggage about and quarreling with the people. Others refusing to go on, having too heavy boats. At 8 p.m. reached Coteau du Lac, where people encamped on the bank of the river. Thursday, July 21st. Morning fine and cooler. At 4:30, embarked and proceeded up the river. Stopped at, there's a blank, at the mouth of the lake. At 4:30, proceeded to the lake with the oars and reached at 4, where we encamped for the night. People lodged in a large barn, some remaining in their boats.
Dr. Burnie's personal journal ends here, but he continued traveling with the immigrants to Prescott, where care of all the immigrants was handed over to Dr. Reed of the Resolution. The surviving Regan children, 4 of them, Patrick, Nora, Mary, and Michael, were left in Dr. Reed's care, and Dr. Burnie left $8 with them as their trunk had been lost somewhere in Quebec. Prescott, at the end of the rapids on the St. Lawrence River, was the place where passengers and cargo were forwarded to towns along Lake Ontario. Dr. Reed reports that the immigrants were generally in a weak state on their arrival in Prescott, but Peter Robinson's brother William was there to authorize the purchase of fresh meat, bread, and milk for all the families, and wine for the sick, before they were forwarded by the steam packet Dalhousie to Kingston. Dr. Burnie left Prescott and returned to Quebec to make his way home. At Kingston, the immigrants first camped on Point Frederick, but its marshy ground was determined to be unhealthy, and they were moved to hospital tents on the rising ground of Point Henry. At that time, there were military barracks and defenses on the point, but Fort Henry itself had not been constructed. They waited here for Peter Robinson, who had gone to Niagara-on-the-Lake to report to Sir Peregrine Maitland, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. Dr. Reed reports that there were 33 deaths at Kingston. William Burnie returned to England and was appointed to HMS Lively, sailing between England and Portugal until December of 1826. Returning to Scotland, he was granted leave in August 1828 due to ill health and eventually retired. Burnie spent his remaining days in Barskew and died on May 5, 1836 at the age of 44. He's buried with members of his family in Newton Stewart Cemetery, Wigtonshire, Scotland. The John Barry remained in service until 1841, when she was condemned after being damaged in a hurricane. The emigrants continued their journey from Kingston to Coburg and north to Scots Plains. By the winter of 1825-26, they were living in shanties on their lots. And I'm sorry, some of the names have fallen off here on the chart, but to Smith, John Daly, John Lane, John Sullivan, Thornhill, Robert, John Walsh, Francis Young. To Ennismore went William Foley, Edmund Gilman, John Kelleher, who has a story all of his own. You should get Don to tell you that story someday. James Mahoney, Cornelius Sullivan, and Patrick Toomey. And then a large number of names to Emily, which aren't connected with here. To Darrow, Daniel Maloney. To Otonabee, Thomas Casey, James Condon, David Hogan, Martin O'Brien, James Slattery, and then a number with locations unknown. And you'll see this Michael Dunhill, Dewhill, Dayhill, it's spelled 3 different ways. We never find out what happened to that child that was ill. And the parents thought it would be dead by morning. Well, it didn't die any time that Burnie had charge of the baby, and so must have at least made it to Kingston. Anyway, also unknown, Leary, McAuliffe. Actually, the McAuliffes were, they were the ones that were the troublemakers, the Learys that wouldn't let anything in their boat. They had actually gotten on board using the tickets of a McAuliffe family. So Leary and McAuliffe are the same family. If you are interested at all in the stories and can stomach reading about the medical treatment of these people, there are a whole series of books available at Amazon. They are the medical journals of the surgeons on the 9 ships. This journal that we consulted was a personal journal. And from this, Burnie then made up the medical journal, which was handed in when he returned to England. And those are all available at Amazon. They were transcribed by Paul Allen, who's a descendant of the Allens who live on, I'll never get the name of that road right. It used to be the 6th line. And I know, is it Highway 28 now that comes up from Highway 7 and then up to Lakefield?
Old 134.
Yeah, the old 134, 6th line, whatever, yeah.
Most
The
people
Allens.
know that John Allen and Bobby Allen, I think.
Yeah, John Allen and Bobby Allen have farms there, and this Paul Allen is connected with that family, so he's a descendant, and he's done all of this work, which is just amazing. The journals were stored in the National Archives the Admiralty Archives, right?
The Admiralty Collection.
Yeah, the Admiralty Collection in England, so he did a lot of digging to find them. Dr. Burnie, in his official journal, says that he lost 5 on the John Barry. Doing this research, I've discovered that the number's 9, not 5. So I don't know what extra ones he counted, but at any rate, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this evening and a little bit of extra information.
Killing the people. They're in castor oil.
Well, Marie, that was a really, really good presentation. And I gotta apologize to Dr. Burnie here. I said he was a gopher or something, but he was a heck of a lot more than that. And your tie looks really nice.
Something I walk around town in a
Yes,
regular
yes.
basis.
Actually, I was the gopher because we didn't know you had a computer already, and I drove all the way back home to Peterborough. Came back.
Well, thank you very
I was
much.
the gopher.
Personal assistant.
Cargo, that's.
In appreciation for your presentation, I'd like to, so excited, I'd like to present to you the book that was done by this society. I think you will enjoy it.
I will, I love these
Do you?
things. This
Yes.
was my thing.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
And,
I'll enjoy this.
Dr. Burnie, I have a card for you. It's worth a lot of money. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Roy, for your input to all this. And I have a bit of a personal note here. I was going to say unfortunate, I'm not sure that's true, but I have 2 of my sisters here sitting up front, and one of them has an old husband. That's Ray Jones, or Ike Jones. He turned 80 years old today. Yeah, his wife's name is Joan. And we're going to stop now, and